Let me give you some contexts of the story I am about to tell you is more understandable. Our cat Cosmo has always slept in the basement every night since I was a little kid. My parents were very particular about this. They would scoop him up from wherever he was lounging and put him in the basement like clockwork. The main reason for this was Cosmo's fur. My parents detested the cat hair he'd leave behind, especially on their bed. I guess that made sense, since Cosmo was notorious for shedding fur everywhere he went. But there was another reason. He was also an outdoor cat. And if one of us forgot to put him in the basement, at night he'd wake the entire household at 3 a.m., howling to be let out. The basement was huge, easily the biggest room in our house, so I figured Cosmo liked having all that space to himself. For years this was the routine, and nothing ever changed. But about 2 weeks ago, Cosmo started acting strangely. There's a little landing at the top of the basement, stairs, just behind the door where we'd usually place him. After a few minutes, he'd walk down the stairs and find a cozy spot on some piece of furniture to sleep. One night I placed him on the landing like always, gently shut the door, and began filling a glass of water in the kitchen. But then I heard something odd. He was meowing from behind the door. That wasn't like him. Usually he'd trot right down the stairs. I thought maybe something was off, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I walked back to the door, opened it, and Cosmo bolted out into the living room, as if he was chasing something invisible. I glanced over to his food dish, thinking maybe he was hungry, but it was completely full. I shrugged it off, scooped him up again, and placed him back on the landing before shutting the door. The next night it happened again. I set him on the landing, closed the door, and began my usual bedtime routine. But once more I heard his meowing, echoing from the other side of the door. When I opened it, there he was, just sitting at the top of the stairs, refusing to go down. I figured it was just a phase, or maybe he was getting older, and I didn't want to admit it. Still, I decided to ignore him, figuring he'd head downstairs on his own, eventually. But then, on the third night, something changed. Cosmo didn't want to come inside at all. Usually he'd wait by the front or back door when he wanted to come in, scratching or meowing until someone noticed. But that night, when I walked past the door, I saw him curled up on the doormat outside, refusing to budge. I stepped out, gave him a gentle pet, but he just stayed there unmoving. A few hours later, I checked again, and he still hadn't moved. Growing concerned, I picked him up and brought him inside, even though he wasn't too happy about it. I decided to let him sleep in my room that night, instead of the basement. He seemed calmer that way. But few nights of this went by, and my dad started getting frustrated. He kept complaining that someone was leaving the basement door open, which in his words was letting all the cool air escape downstairs. Air conditioning isn't free, he'd remind us, clearly annoyed. I assumed it was my sister being careless, leaving the door ajar, but I didn't think much of it. I was just relieved Cosmo seemed more at ease now that he was staying upstairs. Then one night something really unnerving happened. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented. As I glanced toward the door, I noticed a dark silhouette standing in the doorway. It was completely still, like someone was just standing there watching me. I could make out the faint outline of a person, thanks to the soft glow of the lamp we usually left on in the den. My heart jumped, but I figured it had to be my sister. I called out her name, but the figure turned and moved away without a word. I was too tired to think much of it, so I went back to sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered a couple of days later. We discovered what had likely been bothering Cosmo: a flea infestation in the basement. The place was crawling with them, and it was absolutely disgusting. We figured this explained why Cosmo had been avoiding the basement, and my dad went into a full-blown cleaning frenzy. We vacuumed, sprayed flea killer, and washed down every surface. My dad instructed everyone to stay out of the basement for a few days to let the remaining fleas die off. Without a host, we all thought that would be the end of it. But then something even stranger happened. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, just about to drift off, when I noticed something weird. The light under my bedroom door was flickering, like someone was playing with the hallway switch. At first, I told myself it was just my dad using the bathroom. But the flickering continued long enough that it started to seriously freak me out. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Eventually the light stopped flickering, and I forced myself to fall asleep. A few days passed without any further incidents, and my dad announced that the basement was probably clear of fleas. Relieved, I went down to the basement to play video games after school, something I'd missed during the whole ordeal. But as soon as I stepped onto the carpet, I realized something wasn't right. There were still fleas everywhere, just as bad as before. It didn't make sense after all the cleaning we had done. I was growing suspicious that something else was going on. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I went down to the basement and headed to the back storage room, where we kept old boxes and tools. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with an overwhelming stench, something rotten, like decaying meat. My stomach churned as I followed the smell to the far end of the room, where there was a small, unfinished crawl space that connected to the house's plumbing. The smell grew stronger the closer I got, and just as I was about to shine my flashlight into the crawl space, I heard a low, steady breathing. I froze. Someone or something was back there. The breathing grew louder, closer. Then suddenly, a shadow lunged toward the end of the crawl space, and a hand reached out toward me. My heart nearly stopped as I stumbled back, barely managing to avoid its grasp. I ran upstairs, slammed the door shut, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the basement thoroughly. They didn't find anyone, but they did find food wrappers and empty chip bags hidden in the crawl space. Whoever had been down there had escaped through the storm door at the back of the basement. The officer said it was probably a homeless person who had snuck in for shelter, but I couldn't help wondering how long they had been there watching us, and more importantly, what they had seen. Now let's shift to a story from my childhood that still haunts me to this day. When I was about 7 years old, my parents would turn our basement into a haunted house every Halloween. It was nothing elaborate, just some old decorations, fake spider webs, strobe lights, and a lot of enthusiasm. The haunted house wasn't just for fun. It was for a good cause. My parents had this tradition where they'd ask visitors to donate canned food in exchange for entry, and all the collected food would go to the local food bank. Every year, they'd make flyers and pass them around my school and some neighboring elementary schools, which would draw in a decent crowd. Most of the people who showed up were families from our community, but there were always a few unfamiliar faces. My parents didn't mind. They welcomed anyone who wanted to participate, because it meant more food donations. The basement of our house was perfect for the haunted house. We lived in a big old brick house in Pennsylvania, and it had this naturally eerie vibe, especially at night. The creaky floors, dim lighting, and the fact that it was nearly 100 years old added to the spook. That year, as always, my cousins Jeff, Rick, Chaz, and Eric came over to help my parents with the setup and scare people. They all wore these creepy white anonymous masks, the ones with blank expressions, which added an extra layer of fear for the kids. Visiting the haunted house was a big hit that year. A steady stream of visitors came through, and by the evening the basement was packed. But then something strange happened. My parents told me later that a man had come by early in the evening, before things officially started. He wasn't with any kids, which was odd since the event was mostly for families. He claimed he was dropping off some food cans early, because his wife and daughter would be coming later. My parents thanked him, took the cans, and thought nothing of it. As the night progressed, more people showed up and things got chaotic. I remember running through the basement with my friends, laughing and screaming at the decorations and jump scares. At one point, one of my friends, Maddie, came up to me crying. She said someone in an anonymous mask had scared her, which I assumed was just part of the fun. But then she told me something that made my heart sink. She said the person had grabbed her wrist and tried to pull her into one of the closets. I thought it was just one of my cousins playing a prank, so I told her not to worry. But when I mentioned it to them later, they all swore they hadn't done it. I could tell they were telling the truth. They were just as confused as I was. That's when I realized Eric, one of the cousins, was missing. He had gone upstairs to use the bathroom earlier, but when he came back, his mask was gone. We searched the basement, but we couldn't find it. It was just gone. My parents started to get worried, so they decided to shut down the haunted house early and call the police. The officers came, took a statement, and looked around, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint tapping noise. At first I thought it was coming from my closet, but as I listened closely, I realized it was coming from outside my bedroom window. I got up cautiously, walked over to the window, and pulled back the curtain. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it. An anonymous mask staring right at me, pressed against the glass. I screamed, and my parents rushed in. By the time they checked outside, whoever it was had vanished. The police came again, but once more. They found nothing. For months after that, nothing strange happened. Life went back to normal, and we started to forget about the haunted house incident. But then one day I came home from school to find something that still sends chills down my spine to this day. Sitting on my bed was an anonymous mask, just like the ones we had used for the haunted house. But this one was different. My name was written on it in bold black Sharpie. We called the police once again, but nothing came of it. My parents installed security cameras and locks on all the doors and windows. And although we never had another incident after that, the memory of that mask staring at me through my window will stay with me forever. Hope you enjoyed these stories.